11 days. That is all it would have taken. 11 days of walking from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. The Bible itself tells us this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2. 11 days. Instead, it took 40 years. An entire generation, every man and woman over the age of 20, died in the desert, without ever setting foot in the land God had promised them. Their bones were scattered across the sand of the Sinai, from one end of the wilderness to the other. Think about that for a moment. The same God who had just shattered the most powerful empire on earth with 10 supernatural plagues. The same God who had ripped open the Red Sea like a curtain. The same God who was feeding millions of people every morning with bread falling from the sky. That God looked at his own people and said, "You will not enter. You will wander. You will die out here." Why? This is not a simple Bible story. This is one of the most disturbing, most challenging, and most life-changing chapters in all of Scripture. Because the answer to that question will force you to look at your own life in a way you may not be ready for. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something about God and about yourself. Something about the deserts in your own life that you have never fully understood before. To understand why 40 years happened, we have to go back much further. The people of Israel had been slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. Not guests, not immigrants, not laborers with rights. Slaves. They made bricks under a merciless sun, their backs torn open by the whips of Egyptian taskmasters. And when Pharaoh decided they were growing too numerous, he gave an order that still makes the blood run cold. Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile. 400 years of this, generation after generation, born into chains, living in chains, dying in chains. That is not just history. That is the kind of trauma that rewires the way an entire people thinks, feels, and sees the world. Remember that. It will become critically important very soon. Then God intervened. He raised up Moses, a Hebrew baby hidden in a basket on the Nile, found by Pharaoh's own daughter. Raised in the palace, exiled to the desert after killing an Egyptian overseer, and finally called back through a bush that burned without being consumed. God told Moses, "I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their pain, and I have come down to deliver them." And deliver them he did. 10 plagues rained down on Egypt, each one a direct assault on a different Egyptian god. The Nile turned to blood. Darkness swallowed the land for 3 days. And in the final terrible plague, the firstborn of every Egyptian household died in a single night. Pharaoh broke. "Get out," he said. "Take your people and go." On the night of Passover, millions of Israelites walked out of Egypt. They walked out carrying gold and silver the Egyptians had given them. They walked out under the protection of a God who had just brought the greatest nation on earth to its knees. But here is the thing that almost nobody talks about. They walked out of Egypt, but Egypt did not walk out of them. Hold on to that phrase. It is the key to everything that happens next. God took Israel out of Egypt in one night. But taking Egypt out of Israel, the slave mentality, the fear, the broken identity, that would take 40 years. And some of them would never let it go. Within days of leaving Egypt, the first test arrived. Pharaoh changed his mind and sent his entire army, 600 elite chariots, cavalry, infantry, thundering across the desert after the Israelites. Picture this. The Israelites are camped by the Red Sea, with the most feared army in the ancient world closing in. In front of them, nothing but water. They are completely trapped. And what did they say? Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? We told you to leave us alone. It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die here. They had been free for a matter of days, and already they were saying slavery was better. Already they were rewriting 400 years of whips and chains, as if it had been preferable to one moment of uncertainty. This is not ancient history, This is human nature laid bare. We do this too. We romanticize the prisons we know because we are terrified of the freedom we do not. We choose familiar pain over unfamiliar possibility almost every single time. But God was not finished. Moses lifted his staff, a violent east wind howled through the night, and by morning the sea had split in two, two walls of water standing on either side, and between them dry ground. An entire nation walked through on foot, men and women and children and livestock. When the Egyptian army followed them in, God released the waters. Every chariot, every horse, every soldier, gone. In minutes, the most powerful army on the planet ceased to exist. Israel erupted in celebration. They sang and danced. It was the greatest day in their history. But here is something most people miss. The Red Sea was not just a rescue. It was a severance. When those waters crashed down on the Egyptian army, they also crashed down on any possibility of return. The road back to Egypt was gone, buried under the sea. God had not just opened a door forward. He had locked the door behind them forever. And yet, even with the door locked, even with no physical way to go back, the hearts of the people would spend the next 40 years trying to return to a place that no longer existed. The Pharaoh in the water was dead, but the Pharaoh in their heads was still very much alive. How long did the gratitude from the Red Sea last? 3 days. 3 days after watching God split an ocean for them, they arrived at a place called Marah. There was water there, but it was bitter and undrinkable. And immediately they turned on Moses. What are we supposed to drink? No prayer, no acknowledgement that the same God who divided a sea could surely handle this. Just complaints. God responded with grace, showed Moses a piece of wood to throw into the water, and it became sweet. Crisis solved, lesson offered. But was the lesson learned? No. A month and a half later, the grumbling erupted again, this time about food. And the words they used reveal exactly what was happening inside them. If only we had died in Egypt, they said. At least there, we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. Listen carefully to what they are doing here. They are romanticizing slavery. They are talking about pots of meat as if they had been dining at Pharaoh's table. They were slaves. Slaves do not sit around pots of meat. But the human mind has an extraordinary ability to rewrite the past when the present is uncomfortable. How many of us do the same thing? How many of us look back at a toxic relationship, a dead-end job, a destructive habit, and think, at least I knew what to expect? How many of us would rather return to a familiar cage than step into an unfamiliar freedom? God could have responded with anger. Instead, he responded with bread. That evening, flocks of quail covered the camp, and the next morning, when the dew lifted, the ground was covered with something no one had ever seen before. A thin, white, flake-like substance, sweet like honey wafers. Manna. What is this? The people asked. And so it was named. Every morning for 40 years, manna appeared on the ground. Every family gathered just enough for that day. If you hoarded it overnight, it rotted and filled with worms. If you gathered too much, you ended up with only what you needed. If you gathered too little, you still had enough. This was not just food. This was a daily masterclass in trust. Every single morning, you had to believe God would provide again. You could not stockpile grace. You could not save up faith for a rainy day. You had to wake up, step out, and trust every single day. Moses later explained the deeper meaning. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, then feeding you with manna, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Think about what God was actually doing here. In Egypt, bread came from Pharaoh. You worked for it, earned it, depended on a human master for survival. In the desert, bread came from heaven. You did not earn it. You could not earn it. You woke up and it was there. God was systematically dismantling the slave economy in their minds and replacing it with a grace economy. You do not work for my love. You receive it every morning, fresh. And here is something that should stop you cold. When the Israelites hoarded the manna and tried to save it overnight, it rotted and filled with maggots. But on Friday, when God told them to gather double for the Sabbath, the extra portion stayed perfectly fresh. The same manna, the same conditions, completely different result. Because obedience preserves what hoarding destroys. When God tells you to save, it lasts. When you try to save out of fear and distrust, it rots in your hands. Thousands of years later, when the devil tempted Jesus in the wilderness, Jesus quoted these exact words from Deuteronomy. Man does not live on bread alone. The manna was not just provision for Israel. It was a prophecy pointing towards something far greater. Jesus himself would later say, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone who eats of it will not die. The manna was always pointing to him. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the people arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. The mountain shook, smoke poured from its peak like a furnace, lightning split the sky. A trumpet blast, not from human hands, grew louder and louder until the entire camp was trembling. And God spoke out loud to an entire nation. He gave them the 10 Commandments. And notice how he began, not with a demand, but with a reminder. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. First grace, then law. First the rescue, then the response. This is always God's pattern. He does not say, obey me so I will save you. He says, I have already saved you. Now here is how to live. Moses then climbed the mountain to receive the stone tablets and instructions for the tabernacle. He was gone for 40 days. And in those 40 days, everything fell apart. The people went to Aaron, Moses' own brother, the high priest, and said, make us gods. This Moses who brought us out of Egypt, who knows what happened to him? And Aaron, in what might be the most staggering act of leadership failure in the entire Bible, complied. He collected their gold earrings, melted them down, and formed a golden calf. And the people danced around it and declared, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Stop and think about what is happening here. These people had seen the 10 plagues with their own eyes. They had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. They were eating supernatural bread every single morning. They were camped at the base of a mountain, literally shaking with the presence of God. And in 6 weeks, they melted their jewelry into a cow and worshipped it. This moment shatters one of our most deeply held assumptions, that if people just saw enough evidence, they would believe. That if they witnessed enough miracles, they would remain faithful. Evidence does not produce faith. Miracles do not transform hearts. You can watch God split the sea on Monday and build an idol on Tuesday. Because the problem was never a lack of evidence. The problem was the condition of the heart. And notice what they actually built. They did not create a new god. They made a calf, the sacred bull of Egypt, the gods they had grown up with. When the pressure came, when the waiting got too long, they did not reach for something new. They reached back for something old, something Egyptian, something familiar. This is what makes the golden calf so devastating. It was not just idolatry, it was regression. It was proof that even standing in the shadow of Sinai, the pull of Egypt was still stronger than the pull of freedom. Have you ever seen this in your own life? You experience a breakthrough, you step into something new, you hear from God clearly. And then the moment things get uncomfortable or uncertain, you reach back for the very thing God delivered you from. The old habit, the old relationship, the old mindset. That is the golden calf. And if we are honest, we all build them. And that is precisely why the desert was necessary. 2 years after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at Kadesh Barnea, standing at the southern border of the Promised Land. They could see it. The destination was right there. Moses sent 12 scouts, one from each tribe, into Canaan to explore the land. They were gone for 40 days, the same number that will come back to haunt this entire story. When they returned, they carried a cluster of grapes so massive that 2 men had to carry it between them on a pole. A single cluster of grapes requiring 2 grown men and a wooden beam. They also brought back pomegranates and figs. For a people who had eaten nothing but manna for 2 years, this fruit was proof the Promised Land was real. It was rich, it was abundant, and it was right there for the taking. "The land is incredible," they reported. "It flows with milk and honey." But then came the word that destroyed a generation. However, the people who live there are powerful, the cities are fortified, and we saw the descendants of Anak, the giants. Now, here is something I need you to notice very carefully. All 12 scouts agreed that the land was good. Every single one of them saw the grapes and the milk and the honey. The facts were not in dispute. What divided them was not what they saw. It was how they interpreted what they saw. 10 scouts looked at the evidence and saw defeat. 2 scouts looked at the same evidence and saw victory. Same land, same giants, same God. Completely different conclusions. Because the difference was never in the data. It was in the lens. And the lens was shaped by identity. 10 of the 12 scouts said something that reveals the depths of their broken sense of self. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Grasshoppers. After everything God had done, they looked at themselves and saw insects. This was not a military assessment. This was an identity crisis. They did not say the giants are too strong for God. They said, we are too small. 400 years of slavery had convinced them they were nothing, and no number of miracles had been enough to change that conviction. Only 2 scouts, Joshua and Caleb, saw it differently. "The land is exceedingly good," they said. "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us in and give it to us. Do not be afraid of them. Their protection is gone, and the Lord is with us." The people's response? They wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb. They wanted to kill the only 2 men who were telling the truth. And then they said the words that sealed their fate. "Let us choose a new leader and go back to Egypt." Back to Egypt. After the plagues, after the Red Sea, after the manna, after the voice of God from the mountain, they wanted to march back into slavery. And that is when God spoke. "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, despite all the signs I have performed among them?" That is not the voice of an angry tyrant. That is the voice of a heartbroken father. "How many seas do I have to split? How many mornings of bread from heaven before you trust me?" And then came the sentence. "Not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed, but who disobeyed and tested me 10 times. Not one of them will ever see the land I promised their ancestors. Your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will wander for 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days the scouts explored the land. 40 years, 1 year per day. The symmetry is devastating. Why 40 years? The surface answer is that God was punishing their disobedience. True, but incomplete. There are layers here that most people never see. The first layer is the crisis of identity. Hundreds of years of slavery had not just broken their bodies, it had broken the way they saw themselves. They could not conquer the land because they could not see themselves as conquerors. They looked at giants and felt like grasshoppers. This was not cowardice in the ordinary sense. This was a people so psychologically shattered by centuries of oppression that they literally could not imagine being anything else. And here is the uncomfortable application. How many of us are standing at the border of something God has promised and will not step in? Because deep down, we still see ourselves as grasshoppers. We still carry the identity our past gave us instead of the identity God has spoken over us. The desert was God's answer to that crisis. He could not remove 400 years of programming from that generation. It was too deep. But he could raise a new generation, born in the wilderness, fed by heaven, who had never known slavery. A generation whose identity was shaped not by Pharaoh, but by God himself. The second layer is the danger of unbelief. And they need to be precise about this. Israel was not punished for not knowing God. They were punished for knowing God, for having seen his power with their own eyes and still refusing to trust him. The most dangerous kind of unbelief is not the unbelief of someone who has never encountered God. It is the unbelief of someone who has encountered God repeatedly and still will not trust him. Is there an area of your life where you have seen God come through again and again, and yet you are still gripped by fear, still holding back, still asking, what about the giants? That is the spirit of Kadesh Barnea, and it can cost you your promised land. The third layer is that God was protecting Israel from itself. A nation of former slaves, psychologically broken and spiritually immature, sent into battle against hardened warriors. That is not conquest. That is a massacre waiting to happen. They would have panicked at the first resistance, surrendered at the first setback. God did not send them into the desert because he was angry. He sent them because he loved them too much to let them destroy themselves. Sometimes the no that feels like rejection is actually protection. Sometimes the delay that feels like punishment is actually preparation. Sometimes God keeps you in the wilderness not because he has forgotten your promised land, but because he knows you are not yet the person who can actually live in it. The fourth layer is the lesson of daily dependence. The manna did not fall because Israel was in the desert. It fell to teach Israel something specific, that life comes from God's mouth, not from the ground. In Egypt, they depended on Pharaoh. In the desert, God was retraining their instincts, day after day, for decades. That lesson could not be taught in a classroom. It had to be lived. The fifth layer is one of the most countercultural truths in the entire Bible. Moses warned the new generation in Deuteronomy chapter 8. When you have eaten and are satisfied, when you have built fine houses and your wealth increases, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God. The desert taught Israel that it is easier to seek God when you have nothing than when you have everything. Poverty drives us to our knees. Prosperity lulls us to sleep. The desert stripped away every distraction, every false security, every competing loyalty, and left Israel alone with God. That was the whole point. The sixth layer reaches beyond Israel into eternity, the prophetic pattern. 40 is never random in the Bible. Moses spent 40 days on Sinai. Elijah walked 40 days to Horeb. Nineveh was given 40 days to repent. Jesus fasted 40 days before beginning his ministry. The number 40 is always a threshold, a period of testing and transformation that precedes something new. Israel's 40 years in the desert were not just a punishment. They were a prophetic template pointing toward the ultimate wilderness, the one Jesus himself would enter. To face the same temptations Israel had failed, and to succeed where they had fallen. Most people picture 40 years of silence, 40 years of nothing, God turning his back and walking away. That could not be further from the truth. The pillar of cloud never left. For 40 years, every single day, a visible manifestation of God's presence hung over the camp. Cloud by day to shield them from the desert sun, fire by night to light the darkness. When the cloud moved, they moved. When it stopped, they stopped. Every day, all they had to do was look up and see the proof. God is still here. The manna never stopped. For 40 years, God cooked breakfast for an entire nation. Every morning, without exception, bread appeared on the ground in a place where nothing grows. That is not abandonment. That is relentless, stubborn, daily faithfulness. And here is a detail that is almost too extraordinary to believe. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 4. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Their shoes lasted 40 years. Their clothes never tore. For 4 decades in a harsh desert, the normal laws of wear and decay were suspended. Every time they looked down at their sandals, every time they put on their cloak, they were wearing a miracle. Scholars estimate the Israelite camp numbered between 1.5 and 2 million people. To feed that many people in a desert, the daily manna would have needed to cover an enormous area. The logistics alone, food, water, sanitation, organization for a moving city the size of modern Houston, are staggering. This was not a small band of nomads camping under the stars. This was one of the largest organized communities in the ancient world, sustained entirely by the hand of God. In a place where survival should have been impossible. And God did it, every day, without fail, for 14,600 days in a row. That is not the behavior of a God who has abandoned his people. That is the behavior of a God who is obsessively, relentlessly, stubbornly faithful, even when his people complain about the very manna he gives them, even when they accuse him of trying to kill them in the place where he is keeping them alive. But there were also terrible moments in the wilderness. The rebellion of Korah, when 250 leaders challenged Moses' authority, and the earth opened and swallowed them. The venomous snakes sent when the people grumbled yet again. Though God also provided the remedy, a bronze serpent on a pole that healed anyone who looked at it. Centuries later, Jesus would point to that bronze serpent as an image of his own crucifixion. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. The wilderness was already pointing beyond itself. And then there was the heartbreaking failure of Moses himself. When the people demanded water, God told Moses to speak to the rock. Instead, in a moment of exhaustion and rage, Moses struck the rock with his staff. Water came out. But God said, "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy before the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Moses, the man who had stood before Pharaoh, who had spoken with God face to face, who had interceded again and again, even he would not enter the promised land. One moment of misplaced anger, and the greatest leader in Israel's history lost the right to finish his mission. This tells us 2 things. First, God holds leaders to a higher standard because their actions represent him to others. Second, no one is too important to face the consequences of their choices. Year after year, the old generation faded. One by one, buried in the sand, exactly as God had said. And as they faded, something new emerged. Their children, born in tents, raised on manna, knowing no life except the wilderness and the God who sustained them. They had no memory of Egypt, no nostalgia for Pharaoh's table, no inner voice whispering that slavery was safer. They had grown up watching the cloud of God move ahead of them every single day. They had grown up gathering bread from heaven every morning. They had grown up knowing in their bones that every breath they took came from the hand of God. This was God's strategy all along. He could not deprogram 400 years of slavery from the minds of the parents, but he could program something entirely new into the hearts of the children. The desert was not a wasteland. It was an incubator. In the desert, Israel learned community. The tabernacle sat at the center of the camp, and the 12 tribes arranged themselves around it in precise formation. They moved together, camped together, and worshipped together. In the desert, there was no room for individualism. You survived as a community or not at all. That communal identity, forged in shared hardship, would become the foundation of the nation they were about to build. In the desert, Israel learned to hear God's voice. In Egypt, they were surrounded by noise. The gods of Egypt, the culture of Pharaoh, the values of empire. In the desert, all of that was stripped away, and there was only silence. And in that silence, God spoke. The prophet Hosea, writing centuries later, captured this beautifully. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her heart. God uses the desert to speak, to make his voice the only voice. In the desert, Israel learned God's timing, and this may be the hardest lesson of all. We live in a world of instant everything, instant messages, instant answers, instant gratification. But God does not operate on our timeline. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, he said through Isaiah. Sometimes the longest road is the only road that gets you there as the right person. Sometimes the delay is not a punishment. It is the preparation that makes the destination possible. 40 years later, the scene had completely changed. Moses stood on the plains of Moab, 120 years old, looking across the Jordan River at Canaan. The entire generation that had left Egypt was gone, every last one of them buried in the desert. Standing before Moses now was a new people, hardened by the wilderness, shaped by dependence on God. Moses delivered his final words, the book of Deuteronomy, one of the most powerful speeches in human history. He reminded them of everything: the plagues, the sea, the manna, the golden calf, Kadesh Barnea, the 40 years. And he warned them, when the Lord your God gives you this land, do not say it is because of my righteousness. It is not because of your merit. It is because of his promise and his grace. Then came the moment that breaks the heart every time it is read. God brought Moses to the top of Mount Nebo and showed him the entire promised land, north to south, east to west. Moses could see all of it: the rolling hills of Galilee, the forests of Lebanon, the Dead Sea shimmering in the distance, the Jordan Valley lush below. 40 years of walking, and there it was. Everything he had worked for, everything he had suffered for, everything he had believed for, but he could not step into it. Imagine standing on a mountaintop, seeing the fulfillment of your life's purpose spread out before you, and knowing your feet will never touch it. Imagine leading millions of people through the worst conditions imaginable for 40 years, and then being told, this is as far as you go. The Bible says Moses' eyes were not weak, and his strength was not gone. He was not dying of old age or illness. He was as strong as ever. But God said, it is time, and Moses obeyed. One last time he obeyed. The greatest leader in Israel's history died there on the mountain, with the promised land filling his vision. And God buried him personally in a grave that no one has ever found, as if God wanted to say, this one is mine. Israel mourned Moses for 30 days. Then it was time to move. Leadership passed to Joshua, one of the 2 faithful scouts, the man who 40 years earlier had stood at Kadesh Barnea, the man who had said, we can do this, God is with us. For 40 years, Joshua had waited for this moment, and now it had come. God's words to Joshua echo through the centuries. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. When Joshua led the people to the Jordan River, it parted just as the Red Sea had 40 years before. The new generation walked through on dry ground, just as their parents had. But this time, they did not look back. The manna stopped the very next day. For 40 years, bread had fallen from the sky, and then, without warning, it ceased. Because they no longer needed it. They were in the land. The time of preparation was over. The time of possession had begun. And this new generation did what their parents had been too afraid to do. They fought. They conquered. City after city. Battle after battle. Not because they were stronger or braver by nature, but because they had been forged in the desert. They knew who their God was. They had no Egypt to go back to, and no Pharaoh in their heads telling them they were slaves. And then there is Caleb, whose story may be the most inspiring detail in this entire account. Caleb was one of the 2 faithful scouts at Kadesh Barnea. When everyone else said, "We cannot do it," Caleb said, "We certainly can." For that faith, God spared his life. But Caleb still had to walk through the desert for 40 years alongside the generation that had failed. He watched his peers die one by one, year after year. He waited for 40 years. When the conquest finally began, Caleb was 85 years old. Most people at 85 are looking for rest. Caleb was looking for a fight. He went to Joshua and said, "Give me this mountain." Not a valley, not a plain, not a piece of land already cleared. He wanted the mountain, the specific mountain where the giants lived, the very giants that had terrified the scouts 4 decades before. And he said, "I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out, for war and for going and coming." 40 years of desert did not weaken Caleb. They forged him. While the faithless generation saw those years as a death sentence, Caleb saw them as training. Same desert, same years, completely different outcome. Because the difference was never in the desert. The difference was in the heart. And that is the question this story puts in front of you today. Are you in a desert right now? Maybe you have been there for a long time. Maybe you feel forgotten, like your prayers are hitting a ceiling and bouncing back unanswered. Maybe you look around and see nothing but sand and silence and wonder if God has abandoned you. He has not. Maybe your desert is a season of waiting, waiting for a door to open, waiting for something to change. Something that has been the same for so long you have almost stopped believing it ever will. Maybe your desert is a season of loss. The loss of someone you love, the loss of a dream, the loss of the life you thought you would have by now. Maybe your desert is loneliness, illness, failure, or that crushing feeling that everyone else has crossed their Jordan, while you are still stuck in the sand. I need you to hear this. Every desert has an expiration date. 40 years is the longest desert in the Bible, and even that one ended. The Jordan parted, the manna stopped because it was no longer needed, and the land of milk and honey was real. The people who endured the desert walked into it. Your desert is not forever, but what you do in the desert determines what you carry out of it. Caleb carried strength. The grumblers carried nothing. They did not even make it out alive. The manna is still falling. The cloud is still there. Your shoes are not wearing out. God is not punishing you. He is preparing you. The desert is not your destination. It is your training ground. It is the place where God strips away everything that is not essential until the only thing left is you and Him. But here is what you must decide. Will you be the first generation or the second? Will you spend your desert years grumbling, looking back, wishing for the pots of meat in Egypt? Or will you be like Caleb, using the waiting to grow stronger, to deepen your trust, to become the person who can walk into the promised land and actually possess it? The difference between 11 days and 40 years was never about distance. It was about the heart. God is not asking you to be perfect. He is asking you to trust Him, to stop looking back, to stop seeing yourself as a grasshopper, to stop trying to go back to Egypt. He is asking you to look at the giants in your life and say what Caleb said. Their protection is gone, and the Lord is with us. Your promised land is real. It is not a fantasy. It is not just for other people. God promised it to you, and God does not break his promises. But you have to be willing to cross the Jordan. You have to be willing to face the giants. You have to be willing to let the desert do its work in you. Because the God who brought you out of your Egypt is the same God who will bring you into your promised land. The God who has been feeding you manna in the wilderness is the same God who has milk and honey waiting on the other side. 40 years of manna every morning. 40 years of cloud by day and fire by night. 40 years of clothes that never wore out. 40 years of constant and faithful presence. Even when his people grumbled and complained and begged to go back to chains. If God was that faithful to a people who tested him 10 times, he will be faithful to you. If God did not give up on Israel in the desert, he will not give up on you in yours. I want to leave you with one final image. When Joshua led the people across the Jordan, God told him to have 12 men carry 12 stones from the riverbed. They stacked them on the other side as a monument, a pile of rocks. And God told Joshua why. So that when your children ask tomorrow, "What do these stones mean?" you can tell them, "This is where God brought us through." One day you are going to look back at this season of your life, this desert, this waiting, this struggle, and you are going to stack your own stones. You are going to tell someone, "This is where God sustained me. This is where he fed me when I had nothing. This is where he carried me when I could not walk. This is where I learned to trust him." Your desert is not the end of your story. It is the chapter that makes everything after it possible. 11 days could have been the journey, but 40 years was the formation. And the generation that was formed in the wilderness walked into the land that the comfortable generation could never take. Do not die in the desert looking back at Egypt. Cross the Jordan. Take the mountain. Your 40 years can end.